Welcome to Dr. Cindy Speaks, regular musings and reflections on politics, current events, and life as a congressional candidate. Dr. Cindy Banyai is a mom and small business owner, fighting for our water, our health, our community. She's running for the people of Southwest Florida, trying to flip Florida 19 from red to blue. Listen as she speaks truth to power and gets real about being a mom and a candidate.
Hello there. This is Dr. Cindy Banyai, or Dr. Cindy Speaks. I am a congressional candidate here for Florida Congressional District 19, that's Southwest Florida, Boca Grande, all the way to Marco Island, coastal Southwest Florida, including Fort Myers and Naples. I'm a mom, small business owner, and I'm fighting for our water, our health, and our community. And I am here recording this podcast at 1:16 p.m. on Saturday, June 27th, 2020. So this is a very interesting time to be around, as well as an interesting time to be a candidate here in the United States. So today we saw yet another shocking, skyrocketing amount of cases of coronavirus here in Florida. We are edging up close to 10,000 cases yesterday, and that was when there was the previous day almost 9,000 cases. So numbers are just adding and adding. And this is something that's of particular concern to somebody like me, who is a parent of a vulnerable child, as it is probably for many people across Florida and the United States overall who are vulnerable and have underlying health conditions as well. These are the people that some think should just be sacrificed for the economy, but I fundamentally don't think that is what we should be doing. I think we should have prioritization around human health and life, and we need to prioritize that and make sure that we are protecting that. And we're in a situation right now where I'm almost at a loss for what we can do, because we've gotten so off the rails with the COVID-19 crisis, and it's sad. You know, we knew what to do. The public health experts and the epidemiologists told us what needed to be done. They warned the national administration in the United States months in advance of the upcoming pandemic, and it was ignored and dismissed, and it was leading us to where we are today. And so we had a lot of time ahead of time to figure out. We used to have a pandemic response team that was disbanded by Trump in 2018, and that's a big problem as well. And I am somebody who thinks that we need to have a government that's a well-oiled machine functioning behind us, like an operating system almost on our computers, where it just runs. It just runs, it does what we want. And sometimes we get mad, right? I think anybody who's been around through the several genesis of the Windows system, we get mad at our operating systems, and it doesn't always work the way that we want, and there's always room for improvement. But who wants to go back to DOS, right? Nobody's screaming to go back to DOS, just like we shouldn't be screaming to dismantle our government, which is exactly what's happened under the guise of fiscal conservatism and under the guise of, the Republican Party saying that we need to just not put people in place, and we're going to put cronies into positions in our government, and we're just going to continue to underfund. The thing is that what we see in this pandemic is that we actually really need our government to work. We need to have it functioning, because the times that we want the government to function is when it's an emergency and you need to spin up things very quickly. And I just wish that we had that, engagement and had that emphasis beforehand, and we don't. And it's a shame. And so I don't really know what to do anymore, because we had a playbook. We had a pandemic playbook for the U.S. government and, for the global community. And it kind of told us what we needed to do. And we didn't do it, or we didn't do it well. Let's say we really half-assed it. Let's put it that way. We really half-assed it. And here we are. And so I don't really know what to tell anybody anymore what to do. It's just this situation where we are seeing spikes, and we're seeing people who are reluctant to even believe the situation that we have a pandemic. And that strictly goes back to leadership for me, because if we had told everybody it was real instead of trying to get people to be convinced that it was a hoax for months on end, that we would not be in the situation we are right now. And between that and the actual coordination between the federal and the state and the local level, rather than the competition between them to devise policy, has left us completely, completely lost. We're lost. And all we can really do now is just ride the wave from here until the end, until there's a vaccine, until there's a built up immunity around it. I don't know, but we're in pretty uncharted territory right now, because we were supposed to follow the book, and the book got thrown out the window. But anyway, so that's kind of what's going on here in this date and time. And I am staying home, as I have been since the beginning of March. I am self-isolating as much as possible to help keep my young and vulnerable daughter safe, as well as my other children and myself. It's that serious. And but that means I'm running a 100% virtual campaign, which is why I started this broadcast. So I had the ability to connect with people and learn a lot. And that's exactly what we have going on here today. So I have a fantastic guest, and we're going to talk about some new ways of thinking around the economy. And this is going to be a very fascinating discussion. And he is calling in right now. So let's go ahead and get this started. I have Scott Ferguson calling in here. Hello, Scott.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. I can hear you just fine.
Okay, good. That's fantastic. Because yesterday my mic wasn't working, and I talked to myself for about 15 minutes before I realized that my mic wasn't working. So I'm glad
that's the worst.
I'm glad that it's working here today. So I think that and thank you so much for being here. This is going to be a very exciting conversation. And it's kind of, I learned about the modern monetary theory in a kind of roundabout way. It was very interesting. I actually was calling folks, and I was introduced to the concept by somebody that I had just happened to have called to introduce to my campaign. And then I was connected with Scott, who told me a little bit more about it. And just before we launch into it, I want to say that the reason I think this is so fascinating is because it really kind of puts together some of the fundamental understandings about our economy that I held before I was able to put words around it. So, and I hope that we'll learn a lot more about it. But Scott, can you go ahead and just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself, and what is it that you do?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I think the fact that you found me in a very grassroots way speaks to the just the incredible enthusiasm there is with just everyday people about modern monetary theory. I myself am a professor. I'm an associate professor of humanities and cultural studies at the University of South Florida at the Tampa campus. I specialize in media culture, moving image culture. I teach movies. I teach, pop Hollywood stuff all the way to obscure old avant-garde stuff. I'm also very interested in political economy or economics, but I approach political economy from what's known as a heterodox perspective. So there's a orthodox perspective that is taught in the mainstream economics programs in this country and in the UK and around the world, and that's known as neoclassical economics. It goes back to older 19th century ideas and has been developed over time. I am, by contrast, interested in more critical ideas that don't take the neoclassical orthodox stories for the way that economics works for granted. And then my own work at the university and in my own publishing, I bring this heterodox modern monetary theory economics into dialogue and conversation with my work on media culture, moving images. And this could be anything from just studying the way representations of money work and what they look like and sound like in movies, all the way to how media is financed and what kinds of media is financed over others, and then the question spiral out of there. So I teach this at USF, and I also am a member of the Modern Money Network, and that is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that started at Columbia Law School and now has branches at many campuses across the nation. And our purpose is to raise awareness about the way that our monetary and financial system is actually structured, as opposed to the ways that we're told it's structured. And along with that comes, offering, ideas for different ways that we might structure the economy that's more just and more environmentally friendly, and things like that. So this is the background. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about what some of the basic ideas of modern monetary theory are.
Yeah.
Is that cool?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then it's, I also want to kind of wrap into this conversation who else is applying this as well. So I really, I love your description of it. And I'm so happy that we were connected, that you're so passionate about this, because I really do think it's important that if we're really looking at systems, to think about how we can break those paradigms about what we think we know or what we think is going to happen. And that's exactly what we got here. So yeah, go ahead, Scott, launch us into what are some of the basics of modern monetary theory.
Yeah, we can go to the basics, or I can answer your question about who's working with this, right? So the answer is a lot of people and in a variety of ways. The most high profile example is Stephanie Kelton, who is an economist at SUNY Stony Brook, and she just came out with a New York Times bestseller book in the last few weeks called The Deficit Myth. She herself was the lead economic advisor to Bernie Sanders, first on the Senate Budget Committee. Sanders was in the minority leadership role there. And then she went on to advise him on his 2016 campaign and has been working with him ever since. And Bernie Sanders, bless his heart, learned a lot from MMT. He learned a lot from Stephanie, and actually, has included Stephanie in many of the big conversations around his campaign and the establishment of his Sanders Institute. But he hasn't gone the full distance. So that's one example. To be honest, Stephanie has worked on the Hill for a while now, and so lots of people know about it. The question is who's willing to talk about it. One person that has put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, on MMT and given us a big boost is Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. A little less well known is some more recent work. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib has offered up some legislation to address the economic fallout from the pandemic, and specifically about getting cash into everyone's hands immediately, and more so than the unemployment benefits are giving people, and what the CARES Act has done. And she's working with one of my colleagues at the Modern Money Network, Rowan Gray, to work on some of those ideas. I can come back to what that idea actually is. So now let's just talk about what MMT is. Right?
Yes, let's do that.
Beating around the bush. So the basic idea of MMT is that it is a more accurate description of the way that our economic system and monetary system actually works, as opposed to the way in which the mainstream discusses it and imagined it works. We begin by understanding money as a public monopoly that is founded by the government of the United States. If you take out a dollar bill right now, you're going to see all kinds of evidence of where money comes from. Money comes from the government. Because money comes from the government, it must always be spent before it is taxed back. No one in the world can have access to a US dollar, whether they earn it, working at Chili's, or they make it, by scoring big on the stock market. Nobody has a dollar unless the US government has issued it in one way or another. One way that money gets out there circulating is through congressional appropriation. Another way that money gets out there is through state licensed banks. And what that means is, federally state licensed banks, there's state, individual state licensed banks as well, but that's all predicated on federal authority anyway. So what banks do is they issue credit, which we argue is money. They issue credit on behalf of the US government. The upshot of all this is because the United States government is the source of the currency, and it makes the currency, it can't actually ever run out of the currency. And what this means then is that the federal government has a lot more fiscal policy space than orthodox economics and orthodox political rhetoric allows for. Our argument is a government that issues its own currency like the United States can always afford what is available to be purchased or can be mobilized in terms of material resources, labor, and know-how, right? So long as that stuff is out there to be bought or to be put into action. When there are not resources or when there's not enough labor, then there are limits to spending, and there are real material limits. And that's why, from an MMT point of view, we say the limits to spending are real resources and labor. They're not so-called affordability. So one analogy we like to point to, there's actually a few, but one we like to point to is, when we go to a Tampa Bay Lightning game, right? We don't sit there worrying on driving down to the game if the referees are going to have enough points to award when the goals are scored. And oh my gosh, what if they score like 30 goals tonight? It's like unprecedented. We don't then ask, are the referees going to borrow points from other top teams in the league who have earned a lot of points? This is ridiculous. So the federal government is like that. It's kind of like a scorekeeper or a point awarder. Another analogy is like a parent's chore chart. We both have kids, and we probably have versions of this. We're always adjusting ours to, deal with whatever behavioral issue is happening in our house. And, you could buy stickers in the store, or you could just draw stars on the chore chart, right? And at no point do you run out of those stars, right? That's just ridiculous. The real limit is, well, what kind of behavior, what kinds of chores, what kinds of, being polite, setting the table, what kinds of things can you get your kids to do through this counting system, essentially, right? So that's like MMT 101. Maybe we'll pause there and you can ask me questions.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting back on that. And you and I have had this conversation. We've been talking about this for a little bit. And, as I started out with, I really gravitated toward this once you were explaining it, because this is kind of how I explain it to my students at Florida Gulf Coast University when we do talk about the economy as well, and how much of it is related to perception, and that actually that numbers, these large numbers, trillions, billions, we don't really have a good grasp of, frankly, as humans. And we can count, we get 10. Like, this is what I tell my students. I'm like, you see those two hands in front of you? That's about the limits of your conceptual understanding of numbers. And because everything beyond 10, it's on paper. You know what I mean? Or it's just a marking.
So big. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We have no idea. And so, like, I know I have a section where we talk about like cocaine trafficking, and it's like 340 tons a year of cocaine is trafficked. I'm like, okay, so how much is that? Like, how big is that? Is that like we stacked it up in like containers? Is this like as big as this building? Like, I have no idea, and neither do you, and neither does anybody else, unless somebody's like, calculating it out themselves. But even in their own mind and their own understanding, their innate understanding of the world, they don't know it. And so I kind of based that kind of understanding of how humans interact with numbers into the economy too, right? So we're talking, the CARES Act was like $4.5 trillion or something, but
it depends how you count that. Yeah.
Well, sure, and exactly, and but at some point it just becomes so kind of abstract and detached that we no longer have an understanding of it in like a tangible sense. And
there's a great SNL sketch actually from this last year. Yeah, that I'll send you. It's really funny. It's about Elizabeth Warren and her trying to explain how she's going to pay for her healthcare plan, and eventually just trails off into like, 6 trillion, blah, 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 blah. Well, it's just numbers. It's pretty funny. Yeah.
But it's true to a certain extent too. It's like, here we are, we can get to 10. We know that because that's how many fingers we have. And it's this like very psychological for us. But that's why, when we talk about so much of the global economic system is based on relations and perspectives and perception. And that's kind of what we talk about in my class when I teach global studies. And I love that this has got a little bit more in depth on it that I can really grasp on. But so let's talk a little bit more about what this means in terms of our policies. Like how can this affect our policies, or how should we reinterpret our policy development because of this?
Yeah, that's great. Let me just quickly follow up, kind of piggybacking on what you're saying about our perception and sort of not really having an intuitive grasp of things that are literally beyond our fingers, right? Counting beyond our fingers.
Right.
Another analogy that we use but critique in the MMT literature and community is the analogy between the federal budget and the household budget, or the firm budget. And you hear this in political rhetoric all the time. A politician gets on TV in a debate or on a commercial and says something like, is complaining about the national debt or deficits, and is saying, I don't run my household budget in this way. I balance my budget. I'm responsible in my house or in my company. So, how dare the current administration and the current Congress be so reckless and not balancing the federal budget? It's terrible. And our argument is that this is just a false equivalence. These are not related at all. And in fact, if the federal government isn't running some kind of deficit, then there's not going to be enough money in the economy for you and your household. So it's a totally asymmetrical relationship that just have nothing to do with one another in terms of the principles or the ethics that they're supposed to be following.
Can I just add on to that too, that's actually, it's all just that's a bullshit thing that people say anyway, because the vast majority of people, it may be actually a more of a reality for people who are lower income and living, paycheck to paycheck, because you have to budget when you live like that, or you don't have the ability to have access to capital. But most
you're
people
punished, right? You're disciplined into it, right? But yeah, I agree with you. Most rich people and corporations, like, they're always over leveraged. That's how you succeed.
Well, and everybody, if you're a quote homeowner, unless you pay cash for that outright, you're in debt, right? Like,
exactly.
You got a mortgage. So you're not like quote living within your means or within your budget, because you have debt. We have credit card debt. We have student loan debt. We could talk about that. But we have, all this other debt that we've leveraged to be where we are, especially people on the, the higher, income brackets in the society. And so that has always like rang false to me when people say that, because I know that it's not even true in their own household or business.
Absolutely. For sure. So policy-wise, I mean, we could talk about a lot of things. We could talk about, student debt cancellation. We can talk about reducing the fees for universities, public universities. The question becomes, what do you want to do as a society, not what can you afford to do? Or if you're going to ask the affordability question, you got to say, well, do we have enough, PhDs who can be professors at, our expanding universities that we want to have? Well, the answer to that question is, yes, we do. And most of them are adjuncts, and we can be paying them a lot better, right? Yeah, right. Exactly. So, these are political questions, material questions, and questions of inflation, but they are not questions at all of affordability. I will say that one of the ways that people write off MMT is they do this slippery slope argument, right? And they accuse us of being just irrational. So what they say is, once you open that possibility of federal spending without limit, then that means you really are going to literally spend like nonstop, and you'll never cease, and it'll cause hyperinflation. And we're not advocating for irrationality. You don't throw everything else out the door. You just shift the conversation. One major policy. So mostly MMT is descriptive and says, look, the policies, the fiscal space, or the fiscal policy space is much larger than you think it is. Certainly in a recession or depression like we're in right now, it's wide open because millions of people are unemployed. So you've got all kinds of possibilities, right? If you want to use the public purse. But so it's about shifting the frame, shifting the conversation, and then the primary policy that we advocate for, although we do advocate for others, the primary one is a public option for work. It has different names. One of them is the job guarantee or the jobs guarantee. And essentially what this does is it goes back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights and the demands of the Civil Rights Movement and the March on Washington and beyond, and takes up the idea that everyone has a right to decent, well-paid work, a job in our society, and that the private sector cannot ensure that for everyone because it operates according to the profit motive, and it's got to be lean in places, and the private sector's job is not to make sure everyone is included, right? So that's the public sector's job. And our argument is that, oh my goodness, there's always more to be done. We're not obsessed with the Protestant work ethic. We're not like work taskmasters. We actually think you can lessen the overall average workday through a job guarantee. So, we're not totally obsessed with work, but we think that everyone should have a right to a public job, doing something in and for their community. It would be federally funded, but it would be administered across sectors and across levels of governance. So we could have like old school New Deal federal works projects, nothing wrong with that. You can also have state level projects. You can have county and city level projects. You could even get, even more kind of innovative and do like municipal councils or neighborhood projects that could have access to these federal grants if they, complied by certain standards. Also, as one of the great modern monetary theorists who writes a lot about the job guarantee, Pavlina Cherneva, will often say, you can fund the nonprofit sector to hire people. Of course, they're always looking for people, and especially in a recession, they're the ones who have to, cut first. So imagine giving Habitat for Humanity a bunch of grants to hire people to help them. Imagine Meals on Wheels getting those grants, right? And so that way we're having community work done by people who are already doing it, and they can just expand their enterprise rather than having to like invent things from scratch. And what the job guarantee does is it not only gives everybody who is willing and able training and a job, but it also sets what we call a wage and benefits floor for the entire economy. And that says that, it's politics. You have to decide what it's going to be. Like, let's say we want a really, really robust wage floor. And let's say we make it $22 an hour, right? Whatever. And then you bake in certain benefits like paid vacation and paid sick time and all the delicious goodies that we want to make a good society, right? And what that does is it sets the standard for the entire economy. And it doesn't just do so by the letter, right? It's not even just a law that says, well, everybody must comply. It actually embodies it, because it just starts paying $22 an hour to a whole host of people with all of these privileges. And then what does that do to the low paid, precarious service sector that our society mostly runs on? It says to that sector, you are going to lose employees left and right going to work in community gardens or pushing in to teach art in schools or cleaning up our cities and straightening sidewalks and retrofitting buildings for ecological improvement. You're going to lose these workers unless you pay them a little bit more than $22 an hour and you give them decent benefits. And basically, if you don't pay up, then you're out, essentially.
Yeah, and I love that. I love that because that's part of the market, right? That forcing that, you have to compete. So, and it allows for that free market thinking, and the private sector can be the private sector and do their thing. But ultimately, there's going to be competition in that workforce pool. So
exactly.
I love that aspect of it because it kind of sidesteps the whole regulation component that a lot of the conservatives want to rail against, saying, oh, the government's over-regulating and they're doing this. Well, we don't have to regulate. So if there is this universal job guarantee and like you said, there is a floor for wages and benefits, then they inherently have to compete.
Exactly. And what this requires then is for us, progressives, or, however you want to describe yourself, to take back the discourse of dynamism and innovation back into the public sector. Since the Reagan Revolution, we've been all taught and brainwashed from a very early age to think of government, as the worst thing, the sluggish thing, all the red tape and all the approval, and you can't do anything dynamic and interesting there. Not only is that wrong, but it also becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where people who are big thinkers and dynamic and want to shake stuff up and try new things don't go into public service, right? So, I mean, I think that's changing a little bit, especially with candidates like yourself who are getting fired up and want to really see this world headed in another direction. But I think we have a long way to go to reclaim the public as the cool place to be, right? As where we get things done in a innovative way.
And what the Reaganites forget to mention is that the reason that the government is so bureaucratic is because of all the means testing that they put in.
Of course. No, of course it is. Yeah. And then, right, then the other side of that too, I mean, it's all hypocritical and contradictory. The other side of that is that, if we think of Silicon Valley as the great beacon of private innovation, most of the technologies and tools that we now, enjoy coming out of Silicon Valley were all the result of years and
Government
years
grants.
of R&D, government grants, government institution. Absolutely. I mean, Silicon Valley was made by the robust mid-century military-industrial complex, all funded by a government that, compared to ours, was not so deficit averse and wasn't afraid to spend on really big things like going to the moon, right? And that's why we have Siri. That's why we have touchscreen technology. That stuff didn't come from, like precarious little startups in garages in Silicon Valley, right?
Right. This is how Elon Musk built his empire too.
Yeah.
I want to just roll back to something because my brain started firing when you're talking about the nonprofit sector, because of course I have spent my career outside of part-time academia in the nonprofit sector. And something that has always, I love my nonprofit partners. I really do. There's so many people working passionately to help our community become a better place. And the people who are doing the work, it's shoestring budget, right? It's, just trying to do it because they're so passionate about this change that they want to make. And but there's another side of it, and particularly in the philanthropy component of nonprofits, right? And it's something that over the 10 years that I was in that sector very heavily in this region that I really started to feel uncomfortable with, because this, I love when people want to donate to organizations, and they want to donate to organizations that help our community. I think that's absolutely fantastic, admirable, and needed. What I got a little bit turned off by is how there's significantly large amounts of money that are dumped into organizations, into foundations in the name of philanthropy, that do two things. One, they are skirting these individuals' supposed contribution to our, taxes.
Yes,
and
I
to the
appreciate
public
the
good.
Word supposed. Yeah, go ahead. We'll
Right?
get there. Yeah.
But it's supposed to be their contribution, and they're skirting that around. So that's one thing that makes me upset, because I think everybody should be paying into the public good. The second component of it that really started to make me feel uneasy is the control factor. Is that it's not only just, averting taxes and paying in, but it's also averting or allowing them to exert control and do what they want. So they can put it into a religious charity, or they can put it into something that the ones that I really hate, but the ones that help young women avoid abortion and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, and they're pilfering these young women off the streets and kind of, and that's a very kind of, I don't know. There's a whole lot to that for me, but yeah, so they put it into their own little niche area and then they continue to control it. And then the way that those documents are written in terms of those donor agreements, especially with the states, they live forever. So there are funds that are going out in this community from people who died in the 70s and 80s, and they're still doing what that person wanted in the 70s and 80s. And there's no legal way around it, because it's all about donor intent. You have to continuously honor that.
That's incredible. Through foundations.
And so it's like, it's in perpetuity. That rich person's perspective has an outsized effect on whom succeeds and whom fails in our community.
Yeah.
And it's this is what I was going on, like I said, I was firing on all cylinders as you're talking about this, because I think there's a real opportunity with something like that full employment opportunity to put people into the nonprofits and maybe, derail some of that control of philanthropy in our community. Because here's the other thing that happens on that is that it builds the power structure, the local power elite, because none of the nonprofits are allowed to say anything against their benefactors. So this is one reason why I'm coming into politics, and a lot of people hadn't heard of me because I was very much behind the scenes doing work, is because we were literally barred from saying anything in public, saying anything on Facebook, saying anything to the media about how we politically or partisanly felt. And it was all because of the control of the donors on the industry. So it's really like disruptive to the system and the power structure that holds kind of towns and localities like this hostage.
Absolutely. And that goes all the way up, right? And we're thinking about Tallahassee and state level austerity across the board in our school system and our university system, right? It goes all the way up. And in fact, this is a nice segue to talking about the way that we MMT folk understand and try to describe the actual nature and function of taxation, rather than the way we're all brought up to imagine it working. So what we imagine, and this is already implied in what I've said, but it needs to be spelled out because it's been so naturalized, frankly. So we grow up and we think that the government is running out of money, and that in order to get money, it's got to tax money from the private sector because that's where money grows, like weeds in a field, and it has to gather those weeds back in so that it can afford a few things. So our argument is that because the federal government creates the money, it doesn't need the money. It can always make more money. So taxes don't become fiscal spending. Taxes don't pay for congressional appropriation. When taxes are collected, essentially what is happening is that they're numbers on a computer and they're being deleted. Because again, when my kid comes with all the stars that I've given him over the last week for all the good things that he did, and he's like, "Can I have my toy or my screen time now?" Right? I don't need those stars, right? I don't use those stars for anything, right? I just needed him to do some good things. The same thing is here too. So what are taxes for? So when people hear that, they're like, "Oh, then why bother paying taxes at all? This is ridiculous. This is just a big hoax." And we say, no, that actually you need a federal tax system in order to, what we say, anchor and drive the currency. That a currency is actually a tax credit at the bottom of things. It's basically, you owe the government a series of things. And this, simplistically, it's the federal government. But in fact, it's all levels, including like court fees and fines. And, really, what the US dollar is a unit of obligation and settlement. And so you need to be obliged to pay various kinds of taxes in order to be looped into the system and for the system to work and to basically hope, ideally, to make us collectively work together to make a decent place to live. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's the function of taxation, we say, not to pay for programs. Now, what this means then is when we are fighting our political fights and making our cases for why we should have a job guarantee or cancel student debt or a Green New Deal or whatever it is that we're interested in, we need to separate the politics of taxation from the politics of a particular fiscal project. So if you're a progressive using MMT, you would say, yes, please tax the rich. That's a great idea because we have such wealth inequality and such a polarized society that, as you were saying, at the local level, creates gigantic disparities in political power, such that somebody like Michael Bloomberg can just like buy his way into an election that many other people with lots of better ideas would have liked to have gotten into. But they didn't have the money to just barge in, right? And that's just one extreme example. So our argument would be you tax the rich in order to have a better democracy, to have more equal distribution of power, right? Not to so-called recycle their money, and then have the battle about what you want, a job guarantee or whatever, have that be its own separate thing. And this way you prevent the pundits and the conversation from sliding into these scare tactics about, well, raising taxes on the middle class, right? Well, if we want universal health care, well, you seemingly comfortable white middle class person, sorry, you're going to have to pay more in taxes. And even if Bernie does the math for you and says that you'll be saving in the long run, you just don't like the idea of your taxes going up. And our argument would be your taxes don't need to go up. That's absurd. So separating those fights is so important. Yeah. And I think another reason you want to separate those fights is you don't want to give the rich, like your discussion of local rich, right? You don't want to give the rich that kind of power. You don't want to rhetorically say, can we have this if you give us some money, right? Instead, we should just take claim over the public purse and say it belongs to all of us and we should be spending toward public purposes. And, whether you want to pay in or not, it doesn't matter, right? Like maybe we're not going to win the tax fight for a while. In the meantime, we can have a job guarantee and we can, put people to work and build solidarity. And then maybe a little bit down the road, we start winning some tax fights, right? So they're two different dimensions that the mainstream discourse has fused together in ways that basically always make Democrats lose, right? Because nobody wants their taxes to go up, right?
Right, because that comes out of your pocket. Yeah. So great. No, thanks. That was a very enlightening discussion. There's like two other questions that I have. I know that we're going long, but there's a couple things that came up that I wanted your insight on. The one of them was that came up in the debate that we had this week. So there's been a series of bipartisan debates, and is hosted by this it's supposed to be non-political, non-partisan think tank, which is why they invite the Democrats, but they're very conservative in their philosophy. But, I appreciate and honor them in the process. So I participated in their 3 candidate forums as well as their sit-down interview for endorsement, which I am 100% sure that I did not get their endorsement, but I'm hoping that they gave me like a check plus for trying and being honest and authentic in my positions, which is what I was hoping for. But anyway, so one thing that came up in that was, and by the way, just before I go into this whole thing about China, but their interview was actually where I jumped headlong into modern monetary theory because
was it recorded?
It wasn't. It wasn't, which is probably for the best because I'm quite new at this in terms of explaining it on my policy platform. But a lot of their questions in their interview were on abortion and debt, and that was it. And the abortion one, nailed it. Got it. I'm pro-choice. I'm authentic in that. No big deal. Yeah. The debt one, though, was a little bit, and they had never heard the things that I was saying. They're like, are you sure that we just, this deficit isn't a problem? Like, it's not a problem. Yeah. So anyway, it was really a fascinating conversation. But that's why I said I'm going to have to give my friends over there a call again so we can get skilled up and start talking about this in a real way, better way. So the other thing that came up in this debate was about China. And this for me was just, I don't even know where to start because it's just so implausible. But this is a real thing that real candidates in my district, Florida Congressional District 19, that the Republican candidates are saying. They are saying that we need to hold China accountable to our debts, that we need, that they just are basically need to, full amnesty, and that we are going to essentially charge them for the 4.5 trillion or whatever that the CARES Act costs, because the coronavirus was their fault. And I know
I'm laughing instead of screaming, right? Because it's so horribly racist.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And that's where I was saying, like, watching this debate, I'm like, none of that makes sense. I mean, let's say, okay, like, even if you just play the game of, like, let's say that everything that just came out of your mouth is true, there is no mechanism for that. Like, there's no international body that you can go to.
No, it's called war.
Like, yeah. Right? So, like, what are you talking about? It's the same thing with, like, holding, making Mexico pay for the border wall. I'm like,
yes,
that's not how it works. Like, these are just words that you're saying because it revs up your base, and it's all this racist. They're not even dog whistles. It's just like overt racism,
right.
And scapegoating for things that you don't like because it sounds big and bad and scary to people. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that, and, like, what would be a really great kind of response to something like that according to the MMT framework.
Yeah, so one maybe preliminary remark that I wanted to make sure to get into this particular conversation was what MMT allows us to do, and what allows people like you to do who are running for office and trying to shape the debate, is to get away from zero-sum politics, where we imagine that one needs to rob Peter to pay Paul, which usually means taking money from white middle-class people and giving it to brown people that scare them. And this kind of rhetoric, this kind of zero-sum rhetoric, fuels resentment, it fuels hatred, and it makes things even worse than they already are. And every time we get that kind of zero-sum political speech, it just drives me mad, because it's not actually how things work. When it comes to China and the debt, okay, so let's talk about why China owns a bunch of Treasury securities. This is because we buy a lot of things from China, right? As consumers, but also, our industry, pays people in China, other industries in China. So, and they pay in US dollars, right? They don't pay in yuan. So China has a lot of dollars because we want the stuff that they make for us, right? So then they need to figure out a place to park that, right? And that's a lot of money, right? And the government of China actually, right, has a lot of those US dollars. And, there are caps on US bank accounts. You can't just park billions of dollars in, right, like over at Bank of America, right? And I mean, and this is the case for all rich people and all corporations in the world. They do other things. They make investments. And the safest investment in the United States and probably the world is the U.S. Treasury bond. So they buy these Treasury bonds, and essentially what they do when they buy the Treasury bonds is they've got liquid cash, which is essentially like having a bank account at the Federal Reserve. And then when they purchase the Treasury bonds, it's kind of like when you push money from your checking account that doesn't earn interest into a savings account that's less liquid and earns interest. So that's sort of what happens, except it goes from the Fed to the Treasury. And so now they can't spend it whenever they want. They have to wait for it to mature, and they're earning interest in a way that they weren't before. That's like technically why China has all of this debt of the United States. Now, we have to come back to what we were saying about the federal government and where money comes from. We told the MMT version of what are taxes for. Now we have to talk about what Treasury bonds are for. So we say that, well, when we can't find the taxes, the federal government can't find the taxes, they must then go so-called borrowing. And they borrow from the private sector and from the domestic private sector and the international private sector. And what borrowing, so-called borrowing, actually is as an operation is Congress authorizes the spending. The Fed and the Treasury do complex things together to coordinate the releasing of the funds, which is only pushing buttons on a computer that has a spreadsheet. That's all it is. There's no vault. There's no tax dollars that are piled up high in some room that Scrooge McDuck likes to ski down. That does not happen. So they just push buttons on a computer, and then the funds are now available. Then after that, the Treasury offers up these securities and for people to buy, usually rich people to buy, and then we call that, when they buy it, we call that borrowing. But what it really is us just creating more money, creating more investments, and saying, you want to buy them? Sure. And the rich people, whether they're Chinese or the Chinese government or the or our financial elite, are like, are you kidding me? Of course, these are safe. They give me interest. They're going to make me even richer. So the MMT point of view is to say, first of all, selling treasuries is not a borrowing operation at all. Let's separate it from that. Second of all, it's not like a big deal. If you want to keep offering these things, that's cool. Like we can always pay them. We can always pay interest. We can always pay this stuff off because we have the computer, right? There's no problem. And of course, during this pandemic, the Fed is very vocal about this. And if you pay attention to the financial press, you'll know that, people like, the Fed chair, one of the Fed chairs, Neil Kashkari, recently said, we basically have an infinite amount of money to support the private sector through this crisis, right? So where was I? I got
this is let me just reflect back on what I think.
Good.
I think it's because in this, again, this is where I kind of put it into this is a perception, right? So it's really okay. This is perceived as safe. So there's investments made in there, and then those investments are sold to other investors who also see that as safe and a gain. And everything is so interconnected that there's people who are making money in certain places and that are feeling safe with their investments in other places. But that ultimately, like you said, it's just kind of a, check, here's how much here and how much there. It's all on computers. It's not a tangible thing. It's a
it's a relationship. Yeah. It's a scoreboard. Yeah. Okay. I'm back. You got me back. So the second point was, like, no big deal. We can always make these payments. Like, there's debt's not being passed down to our grandchildren who are going to have to pay it back, and they're going to run out of money. And I mean, like, that's not going to happen. And then the third point would be, well, these Treasury securities that we keep issuing en masse have distributional effects. And those distributional effects they're basically giving, welfare checks to the rich. And we might want to ask, do we want to give those welfare checks to the rich? Or maybe should we be spending on a job guarantee instead? Not because we can't afford both, but because for democracy's sake, we might not want to be essentially fueling Wall Street, which is what these Treasury securities do, because Wall Street really revolves around these base securities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a thought that I just flitted out of my brain too, but it's so very fascinating because it is different. It gets into this banking thing that so few people in the United States in particular really have a good grasp of. Because again, like I said earlier, most Americans live down in there where the reality is you do have a budget because you're living paycheck to paycheck and you either get to buy something or you don't. But once you move beyond that into the higher income brackets, into government and into business, it becomes much more of this scoreboard back and forth, wiping debts clean with bankruptcy kind of life, where, that's unfathomable to the vast majority of Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to come back to, how banking works, just like basic banking, it's magical. It's magical right. Compared to what most people think. Most right. people think that it's like the film It's a Wonderful Life, when, the community brings their deposits into the bank, and then the bank has a finite amount of deposits, and then it'll lend out those deposits into the community and earn interest, and that's how it makes a living, and that's how they make a living, and how everything moves forward. But in fact, this is not true at all. The banks do not lend out deposits. What they do is they just magically create credit when they see that somebody is creditworthy, or a firm is creditworthy, or a business idea is creditworthy. They create a line of credit, and they create US dollars out of thin air.
Yeah. So, and it's like an investment on their part, right?
Yeah, absolutely. On behalf of the authorities that have given them permission to create this credit. And so in the MMT world, what we say is money is a public utility. It's a capacity to issue credit. It's a legal construction. It's an accounting construction. It can be constructed in other ways. So why is it that, we pretend that the federal government is broke, and then we give all this credit creating capacity to all these, financial corporations, and that really, aren't doing a lot of great things with it. Meanwhile, we demand that our individual states and counties and municipalities are, tightwads, essentially, right? It's absurd.
Yeah. In fact, that's another thing that a lot of the Republicans in my race are running on, especially the man who is the mayor of Fort Myers here. He's like, I balance the budget. We always said, and the state, there's 2 state reps who are running in this race, and there's I think it's an amendment to the Florida Constitution that says that they have to have a balanced state budget. But yeah, exactly. You're right. Is that it goes into this, then you're pinching yourself unnecessarily, acting as if there is a finite amount of resources, when it is ultimately ends up being just, can we do it? And I want, before we wrap up, where you tell me a little bit about how else other people around the country are using this. But tell me again what you had walked me through before about how it is that the perception works. And the way that I had explained it in my very on the spot way in that interview a couple of weeks ago was that, because we have a strong economy, we have people who are, we have resources, we have businesses, we have production capacity, and that is continuing to go. That's what ultimately fuels our ability to continue to grow and invest in the public realm as well. Because if we didn't have those things, then we wouldn't, there wouldn't be the ability to continue to move forward with the economy. And this is what separates, I guess, well-functioning economies versus, less well-functioning economies around the world. But that we do have this capacity, and it's that perception of capacity that will continue us to move forward. Can you help me rephrase that in a better way so I can help to explain a little bit about why it is that we don't have to be constrained by this mentality that there's a finite pot of money?
Yeah, a lot of that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that's pretty good framing. We often, in the Orthodox perspective, ask the question, what backs the money, right? And nowadays, since the 70s, we live in a so-called fiat money system, with the dollar being just backed up by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, not gold, right? And from an MMT perspective, money was never really so-called backed up by gold. And really, to ask what backs up money is sort of silly and a nonsensical question. What is what is behind money, I would just say, what money does is it creates production, right? And it creates obligations. And yeah, what you were saying, we have infrastructure, we have businesses, we have people with skills, and they do work. And sometimes it's really good work. And, that's why we can always, expand more or change the composition of that infrastructure and production in green ways or more just ways. Mm-hmm. I think the only thing that I would just maybe adjust a little bit in what you said is you kind of started with the private sector. You were like, well, we have businesses and we have production and productive capacity and laborers, and that's what's going to allow us to grow. But what I'll say is that yes, of course, that's necessary, right? When you don't have that, you're in a failed society. But it's also important to come back to government and the public. And yes, I don't have. I'm not giving good grades to our public, and it needs a lot of work. But the only reason why the private sector can do what it does, as we've said previously, is because we actually historically have had a functioning government that for all of its faults, does collect taxes, that does provide all kinds of fiscal support and tax breaks and programs all across the country and beyond. And if you didn't have that, you couldn't have the robust private sector either. And of course, all of this has to be kind of bracketed because right now we're in a moment of incredible crisis and flux, and Congress is sitting on their hands and not doing enough. And so, I think I get into the mode of introducing MMT according to like what was normal times. And now, some of the things I typically say kind of meet some stumbling blocks.
Well, I will say that this is something that I, in my vein, my area is political science and public administration. And I tell people this all the time. I said, listen, the United States government was the bedrock of public administration theory around the world. It was what we would look to and say, this is how to do it. This is how to create democracy. This is how you create civic participation and civic engagement. This is how you set up public programs to invest in our country, in a country. And it was, when we look at it and the way that I had taught it, because I did research this outside of the United States, right? We were using the fundamental, frameworks and research from the US system, and we were teaching it to other countries and looking at it and going, yeah, that's fantastic. And look at, how Social Security works in the United States and what is that function in the economy, and look at how, Medicare, Medicaid, and disability, all these things function at a macroeconomic level. And other countries want to do that. And it was so shocking for me to come back to the United States after spending 8 years abroad and realized we've been asleep at the wheel, right? That we let all of these amazing things that made us strong, that made us a global leader, that made other governments look to us and want to be better. We let that slide, and we let it slide based on this fiscal conservatism. And it's all this like, we don't have enough money, the roof's on fire, we got to disinvest in all of these things without realizing that this is what made us great. And it was. So it's heartbreaking to me. It's heartbreaking because I said, this is my technical skill set. And I look at it, I'm like, oh man, we really just need to get some of this back. We need to get people to believe that it works. And I think I just made a connection to, based on the conversation that we were having here, is that it is the strength of the government that does separate, the economically successful from the economically unsuccessful countries in this world. And I will hearken that back to Jeffrey Sachs and all of his work on poverty around the world, understanding the poverty traps, and that there is a fiscal poverty trap, but there's also a relationship that has with the government. And if you have a government that is not functioning and not investing in the infrastructure, in the capacities of their people, then you cannot have a country get up and out of poverty. It's a catch-22 to a certain extent, but if you think about it in the framework of modern monetary theory, I think you can get a lot further. So you stop thinking from that deficit mentality, start thinking from the investment mentality about
That's
how
right.
to structure it, and you can move an economy out of poverty. But it has to be by fortifying the government structures, because in the vast majority of the poverty traps, the government is one of the key factors.
Absolutely. And if we're talking about post-colonial, so-called developing nations, they're caught in these international debt, right, traps, and their economies are predicated on export-led growth, where they essentially, most of the labor they're doing is being shipped out of the country and not serving their own interests. And then they become just more and more dependent on imports, right? And imports that they have to buy in dollars or euros or whatever. And so what happens is that they don't have their own currency and their own government investing in their own currency and putting it out there. And if they have their own currency and they're not using it enough, or if they don't have their own currency, either way, they need to get and work their currency, and to do so in, strategic, it can't just be all at once, strategic ways to build up the government infrastructure, but the public production capacity, and start creating agricultural production and energy production at home, so that they're not so dependent on imports, so that they don't have to borrow as much from abroad. And eventually, barring anything, we can always have like geopolitical agreements that, wipe debt clean, and that would be wonderful. But if you're just talking about a macro strategy for a developing country, there is a way to use MMT as a framework to get yourself out of that kind of zero-sum situation.
Fantastic. All right, so let's hear from you some final thoughts. I think that earlier on there was a couple things you wanted to loop back to, but so leaving here, what do we really need to know about modern monetary theory to be effective and move forward?
That's a great wide open question. Okay, so maybe one thing I'll loop back to is Rashida Tlaib's Boost Act. And so she's working with my modern monetary theory colleague. As I said, his name is Rohan Gray. And what this bill does is it takes advantage of a particular provision that permits the Treasury to issue a platinum coin of any denomination that it chooses. And then that becomes legal tender because the Treasury has minted the coin. Now, this provision was found back in the Obama years, when there was all the controversy about the sequester and the debt ceiling, and it kind of exploded on the internet and on Twitter, and then lawyers started arguing about it. And the proposal was essentially to mint $1 trillion coin and just pay off the debt, and then you don't have a debt ceiling problem anymore. And then you can just go proceed with congressional appropriation. This is a total gimmick. From an MMT point of view, it's just, we can always afford it. That's not the issue. You don't have to mint a coin. But this was a kind of like a way to politicize and to show what's actually possible, right? So my colleague has been working on that for a long time, has been thinking about it, and then it went out of the news cycle and nobody was talking about it. But he has been working with Rashida Tlaib and some of the other more progressive Congress people, and he floated this idea of minting the coin to them, to the Talib folks, and they were into it. And then they built a whole package of, how are we going to get money to people for relief right away, right? And they proposed that you could use an app, right, to get the money, or you could get a government debit card. And what this would do is set up public bank accounts, and suddenly everyone who was unbanked would become banked, right? And they would have free public banking where they don't have to go to, payday lenders. Talk about disrupting political power, right? They don't have to go to payday lenders. They don't have to pay fees, fines and fees, at whatever the corporate bank is down the street. And so this would, and then there was another component which was about sending out basically like care teams, training and sending out care teams to make sure that everybody who needed access to the app or a debit card was getting it, and would also, be kind of trained in kind of basic nursing and be, going out there and making sure that everybody during the pandemic was doing all right. And it was, it's an incredible proposal and bill. Obviously, like, this do nothing Congress is not jumping on this bill, but it shows the kind of imagination that is opened up when you have a correct understanding of the monetary system, the way that MMT describes it.
Yeah, that's great. And, I said earlier into you is that this is in alignment with the way that I had understood the functions of our economy, our global economy, and our national economy. It's far less rigid than I think people want to believe it is, because I think you get money in your hand and that's real. Right. But what they don't realize is that behind it, and that, that's a small component of the rest of the story. And I think that's what helps us here is that, and as policymakers, yes, we can do that. We have that ability to have imagination and policy development, because the fiscal policy and the fiscal interventions are absolutely necessary, particularly in times like this.
Couldn't agree more.
We need to have that flexibility for innovative thought, to move forward and through it, because it's part of our own design is what's going on right now in the economy. So, and we can be the ones to fix it. We are the ones we're waiting for.
Preach.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott. Is there any way that somebody could learn more about this? What would be a good resource to direct them to?
Yeah, well, I would say is, like, nowadays you can just do an internet search on modern monetary theory and find all kinds of cool stuff, popular writings, scholarly writings, websites, videos, all of that kind of thing. You can check out my nonprofit, Modern Money Network. It's at modernmoneynetwork.org. I definitely, if you're a novice and you just want to kind of wade into these waters a little bit and see what it's like, I would just search Stephanie Kelton, and I would check out some of her videos. She's, very plain spoken, way easier to understand than me. And, and she'll make you feel comfortable as you're wading into these waters. And then, probably also check out her new best-selling book, like, why not? The Deficit Myth.
Great. Well, I love it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and sharing this with me. I'm going to be a good student, and I've already started doing my research on it, but I really think that this is something that we need to embrace and keep messaging on so people understand it, because we do need to break out of not only just the deficit mentality that we bring to our economy, but that there is these constraints and this rigidity that simply doesn't exist in reality. We are our own prisoners in that. We're imprisoning ourselves with that thought. So thank you so much, Scott Ferguson, for joining us here today. And I am going to sign off here. So thanks so much. And I'm Dr. Cindy Banyai, and this is Dr. Cindy Speaks. And we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Dr. Cindy Speaks. If you'd like to learn more about her campaign, go to cindybanyai.com. or connect with her directly at vote@cindybanyai.com. We love connecting with people. Contents of this podcast are paid for and approved by friends of Sandy Banyai.